Hello, I'm Toycat, and I am from the United Kingdom, but I'm going to be giving my opinion and impressions on each of the Canadian provinces. Canada is a ridiculously huge country. I mean, if you superimpose the UK onto it, you'll realize that more than half of the provinces are bigger than the UK as its entirety, and yet there are 10 of them, plus free territories, plus some future territories, and I think I'd talk about each of those and my vague impression of them in today's video. So if you think that's fun, join me for my outsider perspective on what might be your country or one you know well. I think it's always interesting to hear what people think about where I'm from, and so let's talk about Canada, starting from... I mean, it's called British Columbia. It's named after my country, and then also after the continent as a whole, Columbia. Not after, you know, the place over here. Very different place. Anyway, but this is British Columbia, and it's a very interesting place as an outsider, because it feels like Canada's California. I mean, that's obviously inaccurate, because California has more people than Canada as a whole, but it is the very cool, very West Coast vibe part of Canada. In fact, of the western provinces, it feels like the one where stuff is always happening. Vancouver is a huge city with lots of interesting stuff going down there, and it's the place that if you're visiting Canada is probably the only place you'll visit that's west of Ontario. It is the biggest tourist destination in that way, and it's very intriguing. Canada is very British heavy. This place feels like it's much more diverse in that sense, and so whether that's for better or worse, instead of 30 to 50% British as Canada as a whole, it's much more interesting all over the place. And so yeah, if you look around British Columbia, you'll see that it's also, I think because it's so populated, it has way more population centers than the other provinces. So there's like Kamloops over here. I had an editor who lived in Kelowna. There's like all these sorts of miniature cities around the place, so that it's not just one city and one province. It is instead a lot of other stuff going down, including there is Vancouver Island over here, which is a very fun name for an island, by the way, huge island. But yeah, it's got one of the most British parts of Canada, which again, interesting that like we've got the very diverse West Coast that's heavily immigrated Vancouver, and then you've kind of got the opposite in Victoria. Super interesting province, super interesting place, and honestly one of the go-to like cool parts of Canada. But then you've got that. Alberta has a fun shape. It looks a lot like Nevada, right? But Alberta is a fun shape, but it's mostly not known for its shape. You'll be surprised to learn, although the reason it's got this funky kind of diagonal border here is because the border between British Columbia is based on the mountains, if you have to guess. But yeah, so the interesting thing about Alberta is that it's known for being very kind of, what's the word, like almost like Canada's Texas, right? If you have to use American state analogies. But it is an interesting part because it is the most American part of Canada as far as most Canadians are concerned. So this means they have a lot of natural resources and therefore some of the highest incomes for the whole of the country. But that also means, you know, Canada's least favorite thing is being like America. And so for them to have an Alberta be squeezed right over here, I think is uncomfortable for a lot of people. I think a lot of Canadians are like, yeah, that's the place over there. That's the place where we don't like to talk about it too much. And I think that is very interesting because Calgary is a very fun metropolitan city. I want to say it's the 4th largest in Canada. You know, the fact that they've got an Edmonton over here, they've got like a whole population corridor rather than just one big city sustaining an entire province. I mean, it is a very interesting place as a whole, but I also have to say that like Alberta, like British Columbia, you know, it might look like this on a map, but in reality, like, is there anything this far north in the province? Is there anything in high level? I mean, apparently so, but it's a very interesting place. The borders Saskatchewan, and my interesting fact that I happen to know as an outsider is there is one of the only town in the entirety of Canada that is across 2 provinces is Lloydminster. The provincial border goes right down this main road. So if you live on the west side, you live in Alberta. If you live on the east side, you live in Saskatchewan, which is pretty cool if you ask me. Anyway, so yeah, this is I feel like Alberta is always some form of controversial distance away from Canada and a lot of other issues. And honestly, it's pretty interesting when you think about it. Like the fact that Alberta is connected to, you know, say Newfoundland and Labrador is pretty nuts when you think about the geographic distance between them. You know, whereas the US goes deep and it goes wide, Canada is very shallow, but also very wide. And the fact that that works as a country is pretty cool in some ways. It makes for some very wild facts like Saskatchewan doesn't even exist. I think that is genuinely the only times you hear about Saskatchewan is as a joke. I'm sure there are some lovely things happening there. I have to imagine, you know, like maybe if Alberta is the really mountainous part of Canada. I'd guess that Saskatchewan is therefore the super flat bit. There is Saskatoon, which is a relatively big city, I want to say, and the Trans-Canada Highway and a bunch of railroads go through here. I've seen people do freight hopping and end up in Regina before. I mean, it's clearly a big city worth visiting in its own right, but I've never been able to fly into Saskatchewan. I've always wanted to visit just to like see what's going on, but it's always ridiculously expensive, and I guess that's the crazy thing about Saskatchewan. Yeah, the other impression that I have of it as a whole, it's this awkward middle ground because their drinking age is 19, whereas both the provinces on the side of them are 18. So I don't know, do they just hate people drinking? What's the scoop with that? I've never known. Is Saskatchewan even real? That's a big debate I think you might have to find. Then we've got Manitoba to the right here. Manitoba is obviously it's part of, it's what you usually say as part of this Western Canadian bloc, and I feel like it's a bit more notable than Saskatchewan. Like Alberta and British Columbia are the big two of the four, but then Manitoba's over here, and it's got Winnipeg, where I want to say that's a big winter city. Feels like it's roughly speaking the center of Canada. That's not actually correct in the slightest, but it feels like it is. It feels like you've just started to go west. You're starting to see this east-west divide, but in reality, I think like Western Ontario is basically part of the west of Canada. Every time I look at the size of Ontario, I'm still shocked. Like, it's like, yeah. So Toronto to, the two biggest cities, Toronto and Ottawa in the province, they're like 232 miles apart, 374 kilometers. And then from Toronto to the other side of Ontario is 1,300. It's like, it's ridiculously sized, province. Again, just here is the UK on Ontario, and you can start to realize that, like, yeah, just this one place alone is like next level. And speaking of next level, this place is mostly known for Toronto. I remember as a kid, Toronto was the first place I learned about in Canada, because when you want to play on game servers, it's like you connect to a random American server, or you connect to one in Europe, or you connect to one in Toronto. So it's like the name stuck with me for that. I want to say like Ontarians call it like Toronto. You try to like skip all the syllables. Truly British if you think about it that way. But yeah, this is a province that I feel like has that New York problem of like there's a big city where most of the people live in the southeast corner, and then there's probably a bunch of like untapped beauty in the rest of it. Then there's probably all the traditional like there's all the stuff you'd expect, like in terms of like native people and apparently polar bears living in the north. Again, ridiculously tall, but realistically in terms of population, very wide and not so much of that. Also, there is a place called Thunder Bay on Lake Superior. I can't mention there's like two big cities here, like two big areas, and not mention Thunder Bay is over there. Also, wait, Ontario is where a lot of stereotypes about Canada as a whole come from, because Canada's population is quite unevenly distributed. So Ontario has a similar population to the last four provinces I just named combined. However, despite that, because a lot of Canadian stereotypes come from their big city and maybe their capital as well, a lot of cultural output comes from Ontario. So do you know about milk in bags? That's apparently only in Ontario. I feel like this video is meant to be like my impressions on places, but apparently I know a lot about Canada already. Maybe correctly, maybe incorrectly. If you're Canadian, let me know if that's true. But like milk in bags, for example, the funny accents that come from Canada, a lot of that is in Ontario, and ultimately it makes a lot of sense. And so yeah, this is also where Niagara Falls is. That's a fun little fact. And also, this is where London is. I used to think that London was the capital of the UK, but I didn't actually realize it was so close to Canada, so close to Toronto, until you see it on a map and you realize it's just undeniable. Speaking of things that are undeniable, honestly, on all of Ontario as a whole, like it's filled with places that just feel so like British, like partially because some of them are just taken from the UK. So somewhere around here, there's like there's an area called Waterloo that has an airport that like sometimes people fly into. There's Peterborough over here. There's there's Milton over here. There's Cambridge over here. It's Caledonia. There's also Delhi. Okay, well that's not so British, is it? But there's all sorts of very British sounding place names, partially because I believe they came from the UK. But there's also places like Dresden and apparently Delhi and Florence. People were just naming their towns after place. Shetland, they just heard of a place and they're like, yeah, we can name a place after this. Then we've got So Quebec is known as the much more controversial bit of Canada, I think you'll find. Quebec is a predominantly French-speaking province in eastern Canada. Quebec and Canada identity, sometimes they mesh perfectly, and like things that you think of as Canadian are actually Quebecois. The poutine is, I think, the most classic example of this. It's a bastardization of the English word pudding turned into French, like poutine. Although I don't know why poutine would ever be a dessert, but whatever. Oh, because that's what pudding is in English, at least. Yeah, a lot of things that maple syrup, most of it, 85% or something, comes from Quebec. So things that, literally the thing that is on the Canadian flag, the thing they replace the beautiful red ensign with, is actually something that comes pretty exclusively from Quebec. So yeah, Quebec is also where Montreal is. Even though Toronto is a bigger city, Montreal is perhaps just as culturally relevant and just as important. In terms of Canada's big cities, there's Toronto and there's Montreal, very, very close to each other. I mean that like literally geographically, but also in terms of all of the cultural output. However, Quebec is very well known for trying to keep French language alive. When people say Canada is a bilingual country, they really mean that there is one bilingual province, which is New Brunswick, where they have a similar number of French and English speakers. It's not that similar, but it's close. And then there is one particular province where everyone speaks basically French. Obviously, that's not true for the cities so much, and it's not even actually everyone speaks French. But because Quebec is very French heavy, it makes the country as a whole bilingual. So when you think of Canada as bilingual, you're really thinking of either New Brunswick or of Quebec as when you think of the French, and then the majority of the people live in the English-speaking provinces otherwise. But if you're thinking about poutine and maple syrup, you're also thinking of Quebec, which means you're thinking in French or something like that. There's a really interesting history about how Quebec has, there's like a native culture that's mixed in there too that I have no idea about, but I know Quebec is where a lot of that history of like native Canadians comes from. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? You tell me. There's a line in Hamilton where apparently Aaron Burr went to Quebec at some point in the Revolutionary War where America went free. They went over to Canada, and also I want to say in the Reverse War when the UK burned down the White House, I want to say it was actually Canada that did the stuff on that. So good job. This area over here, Eastern Canada, is where they managed to resist America and or take their White House. They won the game of chess. They got to say checkmate. By the way, I have to say, both Quebec and Ontario are such oddly shaped provinces. Look at this on a map right here. Someone has to point this out. Like, it might not look ridiculous to you. If you've looked at a map of Canada your whole life, you're like, yeah, there's like straight lines over here. There's these weird quirky things over here. This might make perfect sense to you, but if you look at Ontario, it's like, okay, so it follows the coastline here, then it goes straight down, and then it follows the river, but it leads to this weird outcome where there's this big bottom peninsula where most of the people in Ontario live. But even weirder is the fact that there's a point where these two rivers, where the border meets, but instead of that being the border between Toronto and Quebec, it's this weird straight line over here, which leads to all sorts of odd situations. So Ottawa, the capital of Canada, is split between two provinces, which sounds really good in theory, but because the provinces in Canada make so many of their own laws, that's how you can have bagged milk in one of these places and, French language only in the other. So that means that, like, half of the city lives in a different place with different laws and different tax codes and different all of these other things. So like on the one hand you have this here, and then you have Montreal, which has similar but not the same problem, where it's pretty close to it's pretty close to Ontario over here, and then also where you have just random towns where like, yep, you are right next to the border. It's very, very, very strange. If you look at Quebec, it's just as strange, honestly. Look at the border between Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador. I really cannot work it out. I really, these must be mountains or something, but no one lives out here, so why did they get this? Also, why is this island Quebec? It really looks like it shouldn't be. Also, just while we're here anyway, why does Quebec get this peninsula over here? Like, New Brunswick looks so awkwardly squeezed over here. It's like a weird little square. It's one of the 13 provinces and territories of Canada. Wow, I bet you wouldn't have guessed that. New Brunswick is interesting because it is the bilingual province in Canada, and so what's going on there. Really, I think it's like a French fade into English. Like the maritime, the Atlantic provinces are very, very English heavy. Quebec is very French heavy. What do you get when you're in between? Apparently a mixture of both. So, yeah, it's the only officially bilingual province in Canada. That's all. Maybe they don't actually really do much bilingually. And also, it's the one province, as best I could tell, that isn't really centered around a big city. There is, as you can see, the Trans-Canada Highway number 2 is over here. Where's number 1? But yeah, you can see that like it actually is like a relatively well-connected state in that way, and it also connects to the US to Maine over here, which is fun. Obviously, if you look at the major cities in Canada, they connect, but this is the last other major connection into the US right there. Otherwise, New Brunswick is known for its ham. I know New Brunswick ham. Maybe it's just Brunswick ham, and maybe it's named after Germany. I'm like 99% sure Brunswick is a part of Germany, right? You know, Brunswick, GA. Where is Brunswick? Where is the original Brunswick? Okay, there's Brunswick Place. That's fun. Okay, so anyway, apparently Brunswick is somewhere, and this is New Brunswick. Then we've got, which Nova is Latin for new, Scotia is Latin for Scotland. And you might think, wow, being called New Scotland, pretty cool if you're Scottish, but it's actually the second place on the planet called New Scotland. This is New Caledonia, and you know what Caledonia is in Latin? Scotland. I don't know why Latin has 2 words for Scotland. You know, why don't I have 2 words for Scotland? Anyway, but this is Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is famous for lobsters, I want to say. I'm pretty sure it's famous for lobsters. And also, the Halifax explosion is the deadliest, like, peacetime explosion disaster or something. Halifax is, if I'm not mistaken, the capital or the biggest city in the province. I've actually visited Halifax, so I have like a little bit of like local knowledge of the place. There's also the Bedford Basin over here. It's a very interesting place, as you can see. I do have to say that the shape of Nova Scotia is very, very intriguing. It's basically set up to be coastline only, which is maybe why they're famous for lobsters, and all sorts of other fishing-based industries. And also, one of the big banks in Canada is named after Nova Scotia. So that's fun, isn't it? In America, there's just like 30,000 banks or something like that. In the UK, we have like a big 4. Canada has a big 4 or a big 5, and one of them's Scotiabank. Isn't that fun? Though they're not headquartered in Nova Scotia. You know, I've looked up these fun facts before. Prince Edward Island is an island, which I only know because every time you think of the list of Canadian provinces, you get here and you're like, oh yeah, that's a thing. Yeah, I see it on the on Air Canada flights. They're like, look at all our provinces. Apparently there's a beach with red sand on it somewhere. The bridge to get to and from it is incredibly interesting. It's called Confederation Bridge. It was the time they actually managed to connect all of the highways up together. I guess this is where Trans-Canada Highway 1 ends, and that's why this is Trans-Canada Highway 2. Makes some sense. Like, wait, actually, that makes no sense to me, but whatever. So you can see they do have, man, I want to see this bridge. Is it like, is it just 1 lane in each direction? Okay, they're doing the bare minimum. If someone crashes on this bridge, is just Prince Edward Island disconnected for a while? That's kind of crazy, huh? Anyway, so I know very little about Prince Edward Island. I know they have beaches. I've seen Prince Edward Island mussels on a menu. Are they famous for that, or do they just have them? I don't know for sure. Also, Prince Edward Island, apparently. Also, how is this also Quebec? You see that? Like, Quebec, when it comes to islands, apparently Quebec is winning. What is the deal with this island? That is very, 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 very odd. Anyway, so next up, the final Canadian province that exists at present. So confusingly, this is Newfoundland, where 90% of the population live, and this is Labrador, where the title on Google Maps is. So again, very weirdly shaped province. The newest Canadian province. They used to be part of the UK until 1953, 1952, 1954. It's one of those years. I think they're also famous for lobsters. It used to be Gander Airport was the connection point between Europe and North America, I want to say. The stereotype is that Newfoundland is like the kind of most desolate and poor community in terms of like, you know, pure finances. But in terms of like the culture and in terms of all the other stuff that's happening out there, it's meant to be one of the most beautiful. There are all sorts of amazing nature things you can only do in Newfoundland. I imagine I've heard they have puffins there, for an example. There's all these sorts of fun things. I don't know what's going down in Labrador. Must be some fun stuff. I mean, they named dogs after it. So did they name dogs after it? Or did they name it after dogs? I don't know the way around it is. Also, this is Newfoundland, but it's pronounced Newfoundland, and I don't get to question that, but that's what Canadians say, apparently. Also, yeah, while we're here, I do have to mention there are also free territories of Canada. Nunavut is the newest territory. It used to be part of the Northwest Territories. As you can see, Northwest Territory got separated quite a bit. It's mostly like native peoples, as well as Canadian military bases. So if you look at like any of these places, they'll build a little community. Okay, actually, maybe this isn't this is actually one that has some people in it, maybe. They'll build little communities out here, basically with the sole purpose of being able to like monitor their territory. Being at the very north of the globe gives Canada all sorts of fun issues with lots of things. It's also a big opportunity because this is where future passages will be found. So yeah, the Nunavut's pretty cool in that way. Northwest Territory has a major city, or not city, town. The population is smaller than probably the town you live in right now, but Yellowknife is a place that people go, and that's kind of fun. Look at that, there's like a little town in the middle of the pure wilderness. This is really the closest thing you can get to like the Wild West today. You know, the west of the US and Canada, it's all been settled, but the north is still the wild, wild north. I mean, for real, you leave Yellowknife and you hit a town called Edzo, which looks like it has a high school, a fire department, and an Italian restaurant. It's a sandwich shop. And then after that, it's apparently just nothing. Again, like I think these territories are probably great for the native people, and like there must be some great benefit strategically to Canada, but it's mostly just untamed kind of nature that way. Yukon is an interesting place because Whitehorse is the big city here. Don't know why people come to Yukon. I know that it's the route between British Columbia and Alaska. I know that probably has some value to someone. And honestly, it's one of those places you hear about. It's got a big cultural like clout to it. Like, oh yeah, out in the Yukon, which tells me, you know, like there's all sorts of. I know there are cars named Yukon, right? One of my favorite pizza places is called Yukon Pizza because yeah, the idea of it is apparently culturally relevant. I don't know what that even means. It is that level of like, well, some stuff must happen there. But again, all of the territories combined have a population less than the smallest province, which is significantly less than the biggest province. So we don't really have to focus on that too much. But we do have to say a little bit because I vaguely hinted at it earlier. Canada slowly kind of expanded west. You can see that looking at a map that they started over here, and then as the continent gets discovered, you can see that like, well, Canada and the US are splitting it like pretty fairly out here, you might say. I mean, Canada's still got just a little bit over there, but then as it goes further and further west, you can see that like Canada just gets the leftover in some parts. Like, oh, look at all of this that America has, all these like super, and then you can see Canada gets like this amount of height before there's nothingness. So yeah, there's a very interesting like kind of expansion westwards, but they're not expanding west any further. But something Canadians are jealous about, because it's so cold. There's a fun like cultural thing in Canada. It's called snowbirds. People who leave Canada for the winter because they can't bear when it looks like, I'll just pick a random town and show you what it looks like in the winter. I don't know if they even do Street View in the winter, right? They can't bear when it looks like, see more dates. What do we got? They don't show it when it's snowy, apparently. They can't bear Canada when it's as cold as Canada is. Have you guys heard that Canada gets cold? This is a really lesser known, okay, let's just, one of these photo bubbles is gonna be cold, right? Okay, when Canada gets this cold, Canadians leave. And so Canada has wanted a Hawaii for a while because Canadians leave to go to places like Nevada or Florida or Hawaii, and so Canada's wanted a Hawaii for a while. And also, conveniently enough, the Turks and Caicos Islands have been looking for a Canada to join for a while. You know, right now the Turks and Caicos are a part of the UK. They've wanted to join Canada for a while. There's this really fun situation between them where it's like it's a recurring proposal, but Canada just doesn't comment on it. Canada did comment on it in 1917, but then the UK was like, nope. He just shut it down immediately. And then the idea of it kind of picked up steam in the 1970s because they're like, well. It'd be great to have that economic integration that Canada has with the US. Canada has like the closest trade relationship in the world of the US, would be real good for an industry that's based on tourism and trade with a nearby neighbor. And also, then Canadians would have their own Hawaii after all, even further south than Florida. Wouldn't that be great for everyone? And the answer is, there's a lot more to just joining a brand new country. But yeah, the Turks and Caicos Islands, like, my impression as it is so far, is it's one of those parts of the UK that genuinely is harder for me as a British citizen to go to than an American. Not just physically, not just culturally. I feel like there's always Americans going to Turks and Caicos. But also, it's like, I think I get 3 months there without a visa. It's a part of my country, but I need a visa to stay there. But I think you get 6 months if you're American. Tell me if I'm wrong about that, but it's very close to that. And so, yeah, joining Canada would be good for me. And so I want it to happen. This is my This whole video was a ploy to start the campaign. Turks and Caicos Islands. Look, they have Canadian-style postcodes already. TKCA 1ZZ. Wait, is that actually not is that like a British postcode? That can't be, right? Do they have one postcode for the whole island? That's crazy. Is that a British postcode? I need to know. Do other British territories have do the British Virgin Islands have a postcodes? Okay, let's go to Freshwater Pond. Let's go to this random hotel. It is 98 UK. Well, this is useless. Well, you know, with that said, that is Canada. The impression, I think, like the rest of the world, I have a very positive impression of Canada. The Canadian idea of like, you know, being very polite and all of these, you know, all of the fun things that you associate with Canadian, you know, like the cuteness of it all, the remoteness of it all. It's very, very interesting because it's, again, such a huge country, and yet it is very rarely known in poor disregard. How often do you hear about someone who hates Canada? It's just not a thing, right? And so that's something I really personally buy into, maybe wrongly. Maybe there's a bunch of Canadians who are dicks, who hate me. I guess I'll find out after I post this video. But if you are one of the cool Canadians, thank you for showing up. I hope you enjoyed me giving my first impressions on your country. If you have something to say about mine, say it. If you didn't like what I said about your country, say something mean about mine. You know, that's what you should do right now. And the other thing you should do right now is, I guess, subscribe or something because the video's over. Or give me money. I make bad videos like this and you can give me money and they will stay bad over at patreon.com/toycat. Wow, what's that? Will you also buy me? I got a lobster roll recently on the Patreons. I got a kebab recently. Look at this tasty kebab, and I will get more kebabs if you give me money to buy one. I think you're meant to say, oh, buy me a coffee. That's what I would love to do with your money. I don't know why I have to be Southern for that. But no, I will buy kebabs if you give me money. Be warned if you don't like kebabs or lobster rolls or weird drinks, because that's what I'm buying with it anyway. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you all enjoyed, Canadians, because I'll see you in the next one. Also, should I do this for other countries? I think like every European nation would be fun. Yeah, let's do that. Anyway, yeah, goodbye. Second channel, don't care.